Welcome to World Social Studies for Elementary Teachers. This is the first lecture in the J series, which deals with strategic doctrine. In this lecture, we examine nuclear weapons. This lecture looks at what nuclear weapons are and how they're fundamentally different from conventional weapons. We'll also look at some of the impacts of nuclear weapons. After listening to this lecture, you should be able to complete the objectives listed on this slide. At the end of World War II, in 1945, the Allied powers were preparing for the invasion of the mainland islands of Japan. Many worried that the Japanese would fight to the death rather than surrender. In the Battle of Okinawa, which is pictured in this slide, the Allies suffered 65,000 casualties, while the Japanese lost 100,000 men. Estimates for an invasion of the southern main island in Japan were between 1 and 4 million Allied casualties and between 5 and 10 million Japanese. The Japanese military predicted that up to 20 million people would die in the assault. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens and soldiers had already been killed in the air campaign, which firebombed urban centers prior to the invasion. In this context, then, when the U.S. developed and successfully tested the nuclear bomb, there was no hesitation in using it. At the time, it was seen as just a big bomb. In August of 1945, the United States dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This slide is the picture of the bomb taken over Nagasaki. 6 days later, the Japanese surrendered. Whereas the threat of invasion and millions that would be killed had not ended the war, 2 cities destroyed by nuclear fire had, which demonstrated the psychological impact of nuclear weapons. The nuclear age had begun. To understand how nuclear weapons changed the strategic calculations of the world, which will be the subject of the next lecture, you need to first understand how they work and why they have such destructive power. The nuclear weapons release massive amounts of energy in all of the spectrums that energy could be expressed. So there is an electromagnetic pulse, there's a flash of light, there's overpressure, which does most of the damage. There's tremendous heat involved. There's radiation, both during and afterwards. And there's fallout, which causes long-term effects. We'll examine each of these expressions of energy in turn. The way a nuclear bomb works is fairly well understood, so I'll just recap it briefly here. You have a core of fissionable material, often uranium, possibly plutonium. The diagram showing here is an example of uranium. And so what triggers the fission reaction is when a nuclei is shot at the atom of uranium. The energy that is released when that atom is hit causes the atom to divide, and that's what fission is. Fusion is where the atoms combine. Fission, though, the atom divides, and when it divides, it releases a huge amount of energy, and it shoots off particles of itself in the surrounding material. Those particles then hit neighboring uranium atoms, uranium being an unstable molecule or atom to begin with, then causes reactions in those atoms. Those atoms then split in fission, releasing energy and material. That material hits nearby atoms, who then split, and it creates this chain reaction, which is what this diagram shows. And so in a flash of time, that fuel is triggered in this chain reaction. And as I've said, a tremendous amount of energy is released each time that happens. Now, a fusion bomb, to quickly describe that, uses an atomic bomb, the fission bomb, as a triggering device. And so it uses a small fission bomb to create the heat and pressure necessary to trigger a fusion reaction between hydrogen molecules. And when those molecules combine in fusion, it releases even more energy than the energy released by uranium and plutonium when they're split apart in fission. Fusion is what drives the sun, for example. And so a fusion bomb is a much larger bomb, but it has less radiation because it's not using uranium and plutonium, radioactive materials, as its fuel core. But it does have a small radioactive fission atomic bomb to trigger the fusion bomb. So either way, whether it's an atomic or a fusion bomb, it releases a lot more energy than any conventional weapon could possibly do. The first form of energy we'll talk about is the electromagnetic energy that is released. The EMP burst generates outward from the bomb like the ripples of a pond if you throw a stone in it. And that ripple of energy flashes through line of sight, basically, and until the curvature of the Earth would shield someone on the other side of the curvature. But otherwise, it goes through everything in a straight line of sight, both in the air and also on the ground. That burst of energy is airborne and sweeps through everything that it hits. It basically has the same effect as if your house were hit by lightning. The problem with your house being hit by lightning is it creates a surge of electricity that runs through your electrical lines, potentially frying your electrical material like your computer or your TV. And that's why people buy surge protectors, so that if there is that electrical surge, the surge protector gets fried, not the electronics behind it. Well, in the same way, an EMP burst will shoot a wave of electromagnetic energy that will fry the circuitry of all electronics in its path. So computers, phones, cars, because all modern cars have electronic circuitry in them now, and computer-controlled fuel injectors and things like that. So everything that has a circuit board on it will get scrambled by the EMP burst and cease to function and operate. This is why back in the Cold War, when the country was focused on civil defense strategies, there was a requirement that every major metropolitan area have at least one station that maintained a room with vacuum transistors, vacuum tubes, rather than modern circuit boards. And that's because if there was an EMP burst, the old 40s technology using vacuum tubes would still be on the air, and the government would be able to broadcast emergency information out. And so that's an example of the collateral damage that a nuclear bomb would have, is it would essentially shut down modern systems. And this is without even taking into account the explosive power of the bomb. This is just the first thing that the bomb does. The next form of energy that is released is light. The energy on the visual spectrum is released as well. And it's an intense ray of light that is released by the bomb. These are pictures from Hiroshima showing that the shadows of things were seared into the material around them. You can see the telephone pole has the outline of the leaves, where the rest of the telephone pole is charred by just the light that hit it. And the bridge, the same thing there. If you are looking at a nuclear bomb, it is brighter than the sun, and so if you see a bomb go off and instinctively turn your head to look at the noise, you'll be blinded. You will no longer be able to see if you're watching a nuclear bomb go off. I had my wife's grandparents were involved in civil defense in Arizona during the war. And as a reward for the good work that they had done during the war, they were allowed to go to Nevada and watch one of the nuclear tests go off. And they, of course, wore protective clothing and things, and protective, welder's glasses so they could watch it and not go blind. But her grandmother reported that watching the nuclear explosion was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen before. And it's because this bomb was releasing light across the entire spectrum. And so it was a kaleidoscope of color that was coming out of the fireball. And she said it was quite beautiful. So interesting anecdote, but you would not want to be looking at the bomb, because unless you're wearing protective equipment, you'll go blind. So light is another form of energy that's released by the bomb. The next form of energy, and the most destructive form of energy, is the overpressure that is released by the bomb. When the bomb explodes, it pushes air away with such force that it knocks things down. And when it pushes it away, it creates a vacuum where there is no air, because all of the air has been displaced by the explosion. And so the air is pushed out, and then the air gets sucked back in to the vacuum area where the bomb went off, creating a whiplash effect that just crumbles whatever buildings. In fact, the strength of a nuclear bomb, one way to measure it is in megatons, meaning how many 1,000 pounds, well, actually that'd be a kiloton, how many 100,000 pounds would, a megaton would be 1,000 pounds of TNT would be the equivalent of the bomb going off. And so that's measured in 10, 20, 50 megaton bombs. The bomb dropped over Hiroshima was about 20 kilotons, and so it was a fairly small bomb by modern standards. But that huge explosion is measured not only in the tonnage of TNT that it would otherwise be the equivalent of, but it's also measured in pounds of overpressure. And particularly when nuclear weapons engineers are designing how the bomb works, that's what they're focused on, is how many pounds of pressure can a bomb generate. And when you're trying to create concrete hardened silos for your missiles, those silos are determined by how many pounds of pressure can they withstand. So can they take a direct hit or not? And so if you are close to a nuclear bomb, of course you'll be annihilated by the explosion. But if you're a mile or two away from the bomb, the odds are you'll be killed by the collapsing buildings around you as the overpressure annihilates the structures. If you're 3 to 5 miles away, your building may stay if it's made of concrete. If it's a wooden building, it'll be smashed flat. But if it's a concrete building, it will probably withstand that pressure, but all of the windows in that building would be completely trashed. I remember watching a movie about a nuclear bomb going off in Denver, and the heroine of the movie was a nurse. And there's this scene where she's at work in the emergency room, and the bomb goes off in the downtown Denver, and all the people in the hospital turn and look at the fireball explosion through these big glass pane windows and have these expressions of horror that, oh no, a bomb has just gone off. Well, that's Hollywood. In the real world, they would all be dead because the overpressure would have turned those glass windows into shards that would have exploded inward. So most of the damage done by a nuclear bomb is not the fire or the radiation, it's the overpressure that up from the displaced air with the explosion. This diagram shows how the overpressure would vary over time. Obviously, the farther away you are from the explosion, the less air is displaced by the explosion. And so the pounds per square inch gets to the point that it could be withstood. And so, as the diagram shows, once you're 5 or 6 miles away, your regular structures can withstand the overpressure, where prior to that, the overpressure is 30 pounds per square inch, just annihilates everything within the first mile. The next form of energy that is released by the nuclear bomb is in heat. And the heat from the energy, from the explosion, expands rapidly. And most nuclear bombs are exploded, they're designed to explode in the air, as the diagram here shows, because if you shoot your missile at the ground, then when it explodes on the ground, half of the energy is wasted because it all goes into the ground. So by exploding it in the air, 1,000 or so feet above the target, it maximizes the air displacement, and which maximizes the destruction which happens underneath the bomb that goes off. So the heat that goes out when the bomb is exploded is that shock heat wave. It shoots air out, but it creates the vacuum, and so all that air comes rushing back in, and the fireball is in the air, and so heat rises, and so all the air that comes in, it goes through the destroyed territory that the overpressure has annihilated, and then rises in a vertical column because it's so hot. The air just goes straight up, carrying all that dust and ash with it. And then as the air continues to expand up into the upper atmosphere, it begins to cool and disperse off to the sides. And that's what creates the signature mushroom cloud of a nuclear bomb. Now, when you have heat that's that intense, it essentially creates its own weather system. This happened when the Allies firebombed Dresden, Germany, and several Japanese cities using incendiary bombs. Those bombs ignited such a hot fire that it sucked the air out of the surrounding regions. And in fact, in Dresden, Germany, there were people who died in their bomb shelters, and they were not killed by the bombs, they were not killed by the fire, they were asphyxiated because all the air was sucked out of the area into this giant fireball system. So when the air expands in the upper atmosphere, like I said, it creates that mushroom cloud, which will have consequences for radiation that we'll talk about in a minute. But from the heat factor, the point to make here is that it's so hot that it vaporizes anything within a mile or two of it. After a mile or two, it will cause third-degree burns and probably kill and spontaneously combust wood and cloth and materials that are combustible. Once you go out to 4 or 5 miles, the heat is not so intense that it immediately kills you. Instead, it gives first and second degree burns, but it also causes tremendous fires with anything that's combustible, paper, wood. And so the fires that are spread by that heat would be tremendous. And you have to go 6 or 8 miles away from the explosion in order to not have immediate effects from the heat of the fireball of the nuclear bomb. This time-lapse picture from the nuclear tests in Nevada illustrate the combination of destructive force that we're talking about. First, you see the light in the upper left-hand frame as it's the bright facing of the model house here. is facing that so bright. Then just a split second later, you see the house beginning to spontaneously combust. All the wood and stucco and everything on that building is immediately starting on fire. And this is just seconds, well, it's a split second after the blast. Then a second or two later, the blast wave catches up to the house. And you see that the house is not only on fire now, but the wind that hits it just knocks the house completely over. And then the final 2 frames on the back is the reverse wave, that whiplash effect that the nuclear bomb has, as the air has been pushed away from the bomb and now it's getting sucked back in. And that combination of air being pushed one way then another just completely demolishes this structure. The structure that we're looking at is probably 2 miles, maybe 3, given the level of destruction that we're seeing. So that heat, air pressure, and light are all illustrated by this. Now the next consequence of the nuclear bomb is the long-term consequence, and that's the radiation. Everything we've talked about so far is just the immediate explosion. Again, when the nuclear bombs were first used, that's what they were thought of as just big bombs. Well, the nuclear bomb is different than just a big bomb because it has this signature of radiation that follows wherever it goes, particularly as that nuclear core has that fission reaction, that chain reaction. That highly radioactive material is being broken up into a million different pieces, and all those particles continue to be radioactive, and they're spread far and wide from the force of the explosion. And so the way radiation kills you, the problem with radiation, is when you have an isotope that is unstable. It's constantly kicking off pieces of itself. Maybe it's a neutron, maybe it's a proton, maybe it's an electron, but it's the atomic structure of that atom is not stable. And so it's constantly changing and losing pieces of itself as it changes. Well, as these bits of atomic material fly off of the atom, they're moving at tremendous speed. They then go through whatever they hit. And so we can, and that piece of radioactive material, as it comes through, maybe it slices through your cell structure as it goes through your body and punches through the walls of your cell. Now your cells can handle that kind of damage. Our cells are pretty good at repairing themselves. So you won't necessarily lose all the liquid in the cell that keeps its ability to function. But if there's a high dose of radiation, then the cells are being hit by more than one of these little particles. It's like being hit with a microscopic machine gun, and it's riddling your body with these tiny projectiles that are permeating the cell walls that can then lead your cells to fail if they have a heavy enough dose. And that's what causes a radiation sickness, is your cells are dying because they've been damaged beyond their ability to repair themselves. And some parts of our cells are more prone to this damage than others. For whatever reason, the lining of your intestines, for example, are more likely to die from radiation than other cells. Part of it is because they reproduce so quickly. Not a doctor, so I can't explain the details, but one symptom of radiation sickness then is vomiting and diarrhea, as the cell lining of your gastrointestinal tract dies and sloughs off, and your body tries to get rid of all that material through, vomiting and diarrhea. It's a nasty business. If cells that are crucial to the functioning of your body are the ones who die, then you immediately die from radiation poisoning. But the long-term effect of radiation is that if you're unlucky enough that when that radioactive particle zipped through your cell, it didn't just punch a hole in it, because again, your cells can recover from that. But maybe it happened to go through the nuclei of your cell, and it punched through your DNA structure. And the picture of a DNA strand is on the slide here. Imagine a little tiny pellet going through that and slicing a piece of that off, or jumbling some of those protein base structures. But it doesn't kill the cell. And so the cell lives. It then divides with that altered DNA structure. The cell is then not able to function in the way it's supposed to, and the cell might continue to divide, creating useless masses of cells that feed off the body but don't contribute to its health. We call this a tumor. And when you develop these tumors, that's called cancer. And so cancerous tumors are the long-term danger that come from exposure to radiation. So that exposure will continue as long as you're near the radioactive material. So you have to get out of the radius of the bomb. That's easier said than done, though. You may be trying to leave the near vicinity of where the bomb was if you survived the destructive effects of the bomb, but the radiation expands far beyond the area that the explosive was. Because if you remember, the rising ball of fire sucks all the air from the surrounding region into it and shoots it up into the upper atmosphere in this column of dust and debris that the air picked up as it went through the blast area and then lifts up into the upper atmosphere. Then as it cools, it begins to fall back to the ground. That's what fallout is. It's the dust, debris, soot, ash, bits and pieces of things falling back to the ground after it's traveled through the radioactive fireball of the nuclear explosion. And so this soot and ash is impregnated by radioactive material. So as it falls and lands, whatever it lands on is exposed to a high dosage of radiation. And that could be hundreds of miles away from the bomb, depending on the wind currents. Wherever the wind takes the ash is where the radiation goes. So essentially, you do not want to be downwind from a nuclear bomb. You don't want to be outside where you can be exposed by a nuclear bomb. And you don't want to be anywhere where the radioactive material can be located. Now, this radiation doesn't last forever. It dissipates over time. And that rate of dissipation is called a half-life. And the half-life is the time it takes for the amount of radiation to be cut in half. So if, just to make up numbers, let's say there's 1,000 rads of radiation being shot out from this piece of soot that's next to you. 30 minutes later, that drops to 500 rads. That means that it had a 30-minute half-life. And the way half-lives work is they decrease in an exponential rate. So the first half-life, where the radiation is cut in half, happens within minutes of the explosion. And now that's from an immediately lethal dose to a mostly lethal dose. So that's no comfort there. But within a half hour or so is the next half-life. The next half-life takes several hours before it happens. The next half-life is several days. The next half-life is several months, and then the next half-life is dozens of years, and the next half-life after that could be thousands of years. And so the radiation is constantly present, it's constantly emitting, but each time it hits a half-life, that rate of emission is cut in half. Now the problem is, if it's a massive dose of radiation, you have to wait several half-lives before you can be anywhere near it, which is why in the core area where the bomb occurred, it could be hundreds or thousands of years before it's safe to be there without receiving a dosage of radiation that could either immediately kill you or kill you later down the road. So the key, though, then, is, if you survive the nuclear explosion, is to protect yourself from radiation until enough half-lives have gone by that you can be exposed for a brief period to get out of the area. Now, what that means is that you need to be in a place that radiation cannot reach, which is usually underground. Radiation, alpha and beta particles go right through things, but some particles can be shielded. Like gamma rays, for example, are very destructive, but they can be shielded by just a layer of tinfoil will stop a gamma ray. But alpha and beta particles will go right through the tinfoil. And so you need to be protected by a couple of feet of concrete, or several feet of dirt will shield you. But a wooden wall or some drywall will not shield you at all from an alpha or beta particle. So again, if you survive the initial explosion, you have to get underground or in a concrete building and wait about 3 days. And after about 3 days, enough half-lives will have expired that you can risk getting out of your temporary shelter and be exposed to the radiation for a few hours to try to get away. If you can't get away, then you have to get to a better shelter, essentially, and wait a few more days before you can attempt to leave. So this is why it's always a good idea, if you're paranoid about being caught in a nuclear explosion, to have a 72-hour kit nearby so that you can live while you're waiting for the radiation to dissipate long enough to get out of there. So when a nuclear bomb goes off, most people think, well, they just want to be right under it so they can be instantly vaporized and not have to worry about it. But most of the victims of a nuclear explosion will not have that good fortune to be annihilated right underneath it. Instead, if they are a few miles away, they will suffer from the consequences of the explosion, but they will not be immediately killed. That's why it's always a good idea to know what to do, how to survive a nuclear bomb in the unlikely event one will go off. But the point is that it's really hard to survive that explosion. This is why nuclear weapons have such a powerful psychological impact, far beyond their destructive capacity, which this lecture has shown is considerable. The emotional impact of a nuclear explosion and having to deal with the radioactive aftermath means that the bomb has an impact that is far beyond that of just a big bomb. There's a leap between a conventional explosion and a nuclear explosion, and that's a psychological leap that takes place. In the next lectures, we'll discuss the consequences of that psychological impact and how it affects how those weapons are used and viewed. This lecture was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.